You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome to Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan. Have we got a good show for you? Wow. My first guest is Julie DiCaro, who is an ebullient and really smart sportscaster, previously an attorney in specializing in family law and criminal law. So she brings a unique perspective, and an expert one, to the issue of violence against women in sports. Then we speak with Dr. Catharine Conley, who is the Global Planetary Protection Officer for NASA, so that we don't pollute other planets as we explore, nor bring back stuff that would pollute us here. Fascinating job, great title. And last, but hardly least, is Dr. Suzanne Kelly, whose book Greening Death addresses what we do about the funeral industry in a wholly different way. It's a feminist issue, which I had not known, and rather than being a lugubrious subject, this is fascinating. And in fact, it's a lift. It's heartening. You'll see. So stick with us. But first, we need to go inside the headlines. Sometimes the stories that will really change society profoundly don't make headlines at the time they come out. One is a recent study. Well, let's back up for a moment with some past history. Even though 70% of mothers and 93% of fathers have jobs in the labor force, Americans' attitude about working parents, mothers as caregivers, fathers as breadwinners, have been very slow to change. But this new study reveals a shift in attitudes, sort of signs of a truce in the mommy wars. Not only do as many as 92% of Americans now favor mothers working, that is, employed, in many situations, but as many as 77% also support fathers not working when it's more ideal to stay home. The data uncover a sharply changing definition of fatherhood. This is really important news. Americans no longer buy into this notion that gender is the most important defining criteria in how families operate. That's a quote from Kathleen Gerson, Gerson, a sociologist at New York University and the co-author of this paper, this research, that will be published in the academic journal Gender and Society later this spring. She says Americans increasingly understand that families face a lot of pressure, and they don't make these judgments about what men and women should be doing. There's a class divide regarding which parents Americans think should work or not, but no major divide based on the respondents' own socioeconomic status. People are more likely to favor single mothers working than married mothers, and less likely to endorse both parents working when their families don't depend on the extra income. I'm using the word working, which is what's used in the study, although I'd prefer employed, because I think when you stay at home taking care of children, it's work. We used to have a button that read, "Every woman is a working woman." Certainly every mother is a working mother. Still, this is a sign that the mommy wars, the so-called mommy wars, could be ending. The national debate seems to be changing from whether mothers should work to how policies could help working parents, there you go, manage. Gerson says, our institutions haven't caught up with these cultural changes. We don't yet provide the satisfying, flexible jobs, high-quality childcare, and the economic resources that allow people to actually make the decisions they deem best for themselves and others. But the most striking shift was the diminishing expectation that fathers have to be providers. The data showed a much more varied and nuanced view of fathers' roles. Scott Coltrane, the provost of the University of Oregon and a sociologist who studies fatherhood, was not involved with the study, but he says that it supported findings from other research. He says, we still have a breadwinner ideal for most men, but when it comes down to practical everyday decisions that parents are making, especially in dual-earner families, there's been a huge change. The main driver of the change, he says, is that job options and earnings for men and women have converged to the point when it's no longer a given that fathers should spend more time employed than mothers. So what happens in the workplace affects what happens in the home, and of course, vice versa. This is an exciting development that was presaged years ago when Suzanne Braun-Levine, who's been a guest on this program, first came out with the first edition of her book, Father Courage. By the way, in this study, respondents' views did not vary much based on their own background, including education, age, gender, and income. But, big shock here, political conservatives and frequent churchgoers were much more likely to prefer traditional arrangements. But families consider factors like health, the chances of a promotion or a layoff, or whether there's extended family nearby to help with childcare. And the survey did not specifically ask about these things, nor did it ask about same-sex couples. But the baseline is that among Americans, there is increasing acceptance that families are making these decisions based on individual needs, whether traditional or not. And that is good news, worthy of a real headline, I think. And now my first guest. Julie DiCaro is like a feminist's dream of a sportscaster because she's a former criminal and family law attorney who left her 15-year law career behind her to give full-time pursuit to her love of writing, especially writing about sports. As a freelance writer, she contributed to various websites and publications, including the Chicago Tribune's Red Eye and Chicago Now, and national outlets such as Deadspin and the Huffington Post. And in 2011, she founded the ARYS, that's AERYS, Sports Network, a sports blog collective written entirely by women. She's now the update anchor for 670 The Score and a columnist for CBSChicago.com. Julie DiCaro. Julie DiCaro, welcome to the program.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You have consistently written about sexism, violence, all of the obvious in sports, but recently you did a blog, a very important blog, I think, about a deal that would have sent the Cincinnati Reds closer, Aroldis Chapman, to the Dodgers, and it fell apart because of the Dodgers learning of a especially violent domestic dispute at Chapman's Miami home. But then you took on lovable old Dusty Baker, the manager at the Reds, for his defense of Chapman. Tell us about that.
Well, I think, I saw Dusty Baker when he was the manager of the Cubs for many, many years. And, we always hear Dusty Baker is such a great guy. And I believe that he is a nice guy, and a lot of people, adore him. But, I think that there comes a certain responsibility when you are speaking for an organization the way that Dusty speaks for the Nationals, or any manager in baseball speaks for their team, or the players speak for their team. And whenever we have these incidents of domestic violence or alleged sexual assault or whatever, we always have these players or managers or GMs or front office guys come out and say, hey, he's a really great guy, and we believe him, and we stand by our guy. And I think that's really harmful, because I think what it does is it sends a message to not only the accuser but the fan base that the team is standing behind their guy, and they don't believe her.
Yeah.
And I think that and in Dusty's case, he said he hadn't even read the reports. He didn't even read the reports, but he didn't believe it.
Oh.
And it's just the that sort of, she's probably lying.
Yeah.
Line that we seem to get from guys all the time. And I think, a lot of teams have sort of realized you can't do that. Theo Epstein comes to mind. There was a sexual assault allegation against Starlin Castro, and, Theo came out and said, I don't know enough about it. I'm not going to comment on it, which is what they really should say. Because, if you look at what's happened to Patrick Kane's abuser, she is considering leaving Buffalo forever because of what's been done to her online. And I think a lot of these guys would do it by themselves, and the Blackhawks did sort of say the right thing, and we're not going to comment. But then they also announced we're having Patrick Kane bobblehead night, and we're going to, they had Patrick Kane out kicking field goals before the Bears games with the Stanley Cup. And, all while the investigation was going on. And I think that sends a really powerful message to women and to their women fans that, we stand by our guy and we don't believe her. And to me, that's really troubling.
Well, you're absolutely right, of course. And it also sends a message to young men who, idolize sports and want to become, sports stars or sports heroes or have this career. And the message it sends is you can basically get away with treating women any old way you want, and we'll stand behind you.
Absolutely. And it's a message that Blackhawks fans, I don't want to say all Blackhawks fans, but a certain segment of Blackhawks fans really took that message and ran with it. Because what they have done to this girl online is absolutely disgusting. And,
not all our listeners will know the details. Just give a fingertip briefing on that.
Yeah, so Blackhawks forward superstar Patrick Kane was accused of sexual assault this past summer. And the charges were, eventually we got the same press conference we always get, which is, there's not enough evidence, blah, 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 we're not going to pursue a criminal case. But meanwhile, this girl has been completely doxxed online. Her identity was out there almost immediately thanks to bloggers. There were sports sites that pretty much were dedicated to bringing her down, exposing her, going back through all her social media and finding anything where they thought she was acting like, a loose woman or, all those old stereotypes and putting those out there for the public. And as a result, she decided, even before they said that they weren't going to pursue criminal charges, that she didn't want to go forward with the case because she couldn't take it.
Yeah.
And I feel like the Blackhawks in some way gave permission to people to do that.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah. And in fact, her withdrawing from pursuing the case is precisely the outcome that this kind of attack was consciously or unconsciously mounted to have happened.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Is it? Before I get psychotically depressed, is there any? Is there movement among the players themselves? I ask, at least in terms of football, of which I am not a fan, but I monitor the violence against women in football, and there have been two interesting cases in the past year or so. One which was the Pittsburgh Steelers cornerback William Gay, who wore purple shoes to raise awareness during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and then he was fined. My God, over $5,000, almost $6,000 for doing this. I mean, by the Steelers, by the NFL, which is even worse. And then the Giants linebacker Mark. Is it Herzlich? I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name. Herzlich. Also made a commitment, a public statement about violence against women. So that's two. Maybe there are more. It seems to me, as a total non-expert on this, that the real problem comes from the money guys, in their boxes who don't care if their players get injured themselves or come away with lifetime brain injuries, but they don't want scandal. They don't want to suspend somebody. They want to, in fact, punish somebody for speaking out against domestic violence. Is that part of the problem or the worst part of the problem?
Oh, gosh. I think that when the NFL talks about doing their education of domestic violence, they need to start with the guys in the boxes. Because we've had Jerry Jones making apology after apology for Greg Hardy. And I'm not talking about what a great leader he is. A guy who threw his girlfriend on a pile of guns and slammed her arm in the toilet seat. And she was beaten so badly that the police said she looked like she'd been in a car accident afterwards.
God.
And, Jerry Jones has been defending him. And, in fact, the only time Jerry Jones called him into his office to discipline him was when he was late for a meeting. Not when he made jokes about women or guns or any of that stuff. And then, we have the Hallis family in Chicago, and, they brought Ray McDonald to Chicago after he'd been accused and dropped from the 49ers for domestic violence incidents. And the Bears, his coach vouched for him. All his teammates vouched for him. He's a super great guy. And when Bears fans got upset, George Hallis said, well, I think that when you're talking about victims of sexual assault or domestic violence, you have to take their stories with a grain of salt because they're biased. And so, it's like these are the guys these are the guys making the decisions, and these are the guys that need to be educated on it. I think there's probably a fair amount of players that have experience domestic violence as children, given the amount of, just the numbers in society they can't not have.
Yeah.
And I'm sure those guys have something to say about it, but they're shouted down, or, people don't even necessarily care what they have to say about it, because the guys, with all the money who sit in the big boxes are the ones doing the talking, and what they're saying is not very educated, and it's not kind.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think is going to make the real difference and change this?
I don't know. I mean, it seems like, the NFL owns a day of the week, like they say in the commercial for concussions. And no matter what happens, we all keep watching. I'm still watching, and I've written about all this stuff. It just feels like it's so entrenched in our society. I think it would take, something from the players saying, I'm not going to play with this guy. Or I don't know. I mean,
that's interesting.
I've thought about it a million different ways. Honestly, I don't know, and that's really depressing.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I mean, we're beginning to see the tiniest ripple of political consciousness, political activism, even among players. Or there was wasn't it Missouri? That was that was school. Yeah. That was non-professional, but where the players mobilized over racism. And when the players themselves, the talent itself, they can't function without the players. So if the players organize over this, that would make an enormous difference. How about you as a sportscaster and a sports writer? Are we really over the days when there was male hysteria? And I do use the word advisedly, because there might be a woman in the locker room. Oh my God, the world would end. Do you feel completely welcome, or has that changed?
I do feel welcome among my coworkers. Mm-hmm. I think that, especially the guys that are sort of my age, who've grown up with women playing sports with them, and they don't really think anything of it. They have moms who love sports, and and dads who love sports, and it's not anything strange to them. There's still definitely, though, when you put stuff out online, and Twitter is sort of the Wild West of getting responses from people, and I still every day get a million people calling me names and, screaming at me about how I'm a feminist and I'm a liberal, as if that is an insult, and there's guys who say things like, God, I listen to sports to get away from women. I don't want to turn on the radio and hear a woman giving me the scores, so that is where I don't feel like much has changed. But there's an older generation that I think is still a little bit like, oh, hey, there's a broad in here. And then, but, the younger guys, especially the guys who have come up through blogging and stuff like that, I feel completely welcome among them.
Well, that's encouraging. I mean, and the viciousness online is part of a larger viciousness at almost any visible, audible voice that is female online. Right. And that's a whole other subject that we've addressed a lot on the program, and that the women's movement is trying to find multiple ways of addressing. Women's Media Center has a whole new project, in fact, about that, called the Speech Project, because it really is trying to drive women out of what is public space.
Absolutely.
So, well, brava for all the work that you do, and for this wonderful, strong, funny, smart voice that you bring to sports. And I hope that we can come back to you many times and get your take on stuff. Can we do that?
I hope so. Absolutely. It's a pleasure talking with you.
It's time for a short break here at Women's Media Center Live. I'm Robin Morgan, and I'll be back in just a moment with some other worldly news. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back. Did you ever stop to think that as we explore out into the solar system and eventually beyond, we have to be rather careful about contaminating the rest of the universe? I don't mean just with humanity, but in fact with microbial life. Well, Dr. Catharine Anastasia Conley, in the year 2006, became NASA's Planetary Protection Officer. Wonderful name for a job, and she'll tell us just what that entails. It's important. Dr. Catharine Conley, Cassie for short, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Really glad to be here.
You have this wonderful title, which is Planetary Protection Officer, which does indeed sound like Men in Black with the sunglasses. But actually, it means that you protect this planet from microbial life, from exploration in space. And now that we're landing on other spheres, you protect the spheres from contamination by us. Is that right?
Yes. In the Outer Space Treaty, there is a article in the treaty requiring that countries exploring other planets should avoid harmful contamination of those locations, and that if we're bringing samples back from somewhere else to Earth, we avoid adverse effects to the environment of the Earth. That is obviously both to protect science in terms of understanding what life might be elsewhere. That's a question that humans have been wondering about for millennia.
Right.
And then if we're bringing samples back to Earth, we know, of course, from experience on Earth that invasive species can be a problem. So we want to make very sure that anything we do on purpose doesn't increase that risk to the Earth itself.
And your attention is particularly focused now on Mars because of the water found or possible, which could be a sign of possible life?
So there are very few objects in the solar system that look like they might be habitable by Earth organisms. Europa has a liquid water ocean under the surface, and Enceladus has a liquid water ocean under the surface. Those are likely places. But Mars, of course, has always been identified as a possible place that might have a native life. And as we learn more about the environment of Mars, it does turn out like there's a whole bunch more water than we were ever predicting.
It's so cool. It's so exciting. I wish I could live another 100 years to see what happens. But if the environment on Mars potentially is as you've been quoted as saying, basically a giant dinner plate for Earth organisms, we don't then want to contaminate it as we explore it by the Opportunity and Curiosity rovers. And that means that they can't visit what are called special regions, places that Earth bacteria might settle.
Yes. So when the first spacecraft that we launched to Mars, landers, we thought that Mars was potentially habitable by Earth life, and so we took very careful precautions to ensure that there were no living organisms on all the surfaces of the Viking spacecraft. The data that we got back from Viking, and then data from orbiters that we sent to Mars and took pictures from orbit of the surface, suggested that Mars was a lot more dry and cold and non-habitable than we thought before we launched the Vikings. So we relaxed the requirements such that the Curiosity and the Spirit and Opportunity rovers and the other spacecraft that we've landed on have been cleaned very carefully. They probably had no more organisms on all the spacecraft surfaces than you'd find on the front and back of one of your hands.
Wow.
But they weren't completely sterile. And so the data, particularly that we're getting back from the Curiosity rover, suggests that frost falls on Mars. There's dew. It's much wetter than we thought, even at this landing site right on the equator, where I did a review, and it was thought to be a really dry, non-hospitable place.
Right.
So because we know there are organisms on the rovers, and because we're realizing that Mars is more habitable, the rovers are prohibited from introducing those organisms into places where they might grow.
It's fascinating because, of course, to the lay mind, of which mine is one, one would think that the traveling through space itself would be such a sterilizing process. But apparently there are microbes that can survive it very nicely. Thank you. You came to this work, in fact, through that discovery, didn't you?
Yes, I had the unfortunate experience of demonstrating that animals can survive a meteoritic-style reentry event, in that I had an experiment on the Columbia shuttle that crashed. It was very tragic, but we did recover hardware, and it turns out that my little nematode worms were alive inside the hardware that landed back on Earth.
Wow.
And so it turns out to be there are quite a number of Earth organisms that are robust when exposed to vacuum. We actually freeze-dry things in the laboratory to store them, and there's a lot of microbes that survive perfectly happily.
Wow. Your actual field, I mean, what is the field of planetary protection officer scientifically called? What is your background?
So there's a wide range of backgrounds that can contribute, because when you're actually doing the job, you need to understand spacecraft engineering, you need to understand the physics of orbital trajectories, you need to understand the biology. So people have come into it from anywhere from physics through cell biology. My background is cell biology, so I came into it from very much the biological end. But I fortunately had as a child, my father was a mathematician who consulted for NASA, so I had some understanding of some of the other issues. But it's the kind of thing where whatever you know is not enough, and so you're going to learn a lot when you start the job.
Yeah, how fabulous, though. Are you the only female planetary protection officer there is? Is there, I hope to God, not discrimination in that field, too?
So NASA is actually one of the success stories in terms of women being in science, and particularly in biology. Pretty much the entire NASA biology program was started by a woman named Thora Halstead in the 1970s, I think.
How great!
Very early.
How great!
We haven't actually gotten all that much progress since then, but certainly there's a long history of women being in positions of managerial authority at NASA. And there is one other woman in the Canadian Space Agency who is responsible for planetary protection, but in other space agencies, it often is men.
Somehow it's very, and I grant that I may be bigoted on this front, but it's very comforting that there's a woman in charge of planetary protection. Somehow it just feels very comforting to me. And it's nice to know that there's less discrimination there. NASA itself has been so beleaguered in the past by the anti-science troglodytes who are against everything from, I don't know, the idea that there's global climate change to probably penicillin. How is NASA doing facing that onslaught? It seems to be making a comeback, but that may be wishful perception on my part.
So there's an interesting balance between the human spaceflight side of NASA and the science robotic mission side of NASA. Mm-hmm. Each of them, of course, has to support the other, because you can't do science without having people doing the science, and you can't really send people somewhere without understanding the environments they're going, and often what they're doing when they get there is science. But because there tends to be, to some extent, some sort of a little bit of parochialism in terms of what the priorities are. So robotic scientists often want to do science and are concerned about humans being present, and then the human spaceflight side, they really want to have people there, footprints on the ground, and maybe don't think so much about the impact that might have on science. But that's a sort of a balance that we have to carry over within NASA. When it goes outside of NASA and you start talking about funding, that then becomes communication with Congress and communication with the rest of the outside world. And although there is very much of an excitement about what NASA does, there does tend to be a perception in the general public within the U.S. that NASA gets a larger chunk of the government's budget than we actually do.
Well, you don't get enough of it than as you should, in my opinion, anyway. Thank you, Cassie. Thank you for protecting our planet and other planets from us as well. Also, thanks a lot for being with us on Women's Media Center Live. Thanks again.
Thank you very much for asking me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
And now it's time for the Surrealism Corner. The Surrealism Corner is quite crowded this week. Quite a few items there. First, Donald Trump. Second, the standoff in Oregon between the ranchers and the federal government. But I am so irate about that I'm going to save that one for more attention in Fighting Words. Number 3, however, Donald Trump. And number 4, you will remember that in a recent broadcast I spoke about the interesting creative program pioneered in Norway, now picked up by other countries, including admission countries like Germany, admission for refugees, which trained young male refugees in the mores of the welcoming country, particularly as regards behavior toward women, which might differ from the cultural context the men are coming from. I pointed out that I think men in all countries, including the so-called developed Western welcoming countries, need that training, but at the least this is a place to start. And the training was done with great sensitivity, both to women's needs and to with respect for the refugee immigrant population. But something went wrong in Germany, as it often does in history. That was unfair to Germany. I apologize, sort of. Anyway, what went wrong was on New Year's Eve when more than 90 complaints of robbery and sexual assault, including 2 accounts of rape, were registered. This was committed allegedly by groups of men who targeted young women in and around the city's main train station in Cologne in the crush of revelers on New Year's Eve. The mayor of Cologne, who is a woman, Henrietta Reker, made an unfortunate remark inflaming the debate in Germany about migrants and sexual harassment by suggesting that women might be at fault because they weren't protecting themselves sufficiently, and that then the women can protect themselves from men on the streets by keeping them more than an arm's length away. Didn't know that? Oh, well, all this time we could have solved the problem just by that. The mayor's remarks also reignited a debate about sexism in German society. In 2013, Rainer Brüderli, a leader with the Free Democratic Party, came under fire for suggesting that a particular journalist could fill out a drindle very nicely. And professional women's organizations have said that relations between men and women are surprisingly backward in Germany, particularly for a developed country. Last year, Parliament passed a disputed quota law requiring leading companies to give at least 30% of the seats on their supervisory boards to women, and of course the Chancellor is the redoubtable Angela Merkel. But the German mayor of Cologne, Henrietta Reker, has solved the problem now of street harassment and assault by just telling us all we can keep men at arm's length. She's tried to walk it back and say that's not quite what she meant, but the advice, I'm sure, is one that all women take to heart. Well, next on the list, I think it's number 4, Donald Trump. Then 5 on the list, the latest sales tax controversy is tampons. Yep. 2 members of California's state assembly are trying to give residents a tax break with a bill that would exempt tampons and sanitary napkins from the state's sale tax. There's precedent for this idea. Most sales taxes, including California's, exempt various necessities. And legislators have done this to shield lower-income consumers from tax on things they have to buy in daily life, like food. While 45 states collect a sales tax, only 13 of them charge it on groceries, and only 1, Illinois, on prescription drugs. But as Cristina Garcia, a state assembly member, pointed out, tampons are pretty necessary. You can't just ignore your period, she said in a statement. But, of course, Joseph Henchman, who oversees state policy for the Tax Foundation, a conservative think tank that usually opposes sales tax exemptions, noted, quote, "It would be nice if necessities were not taxed, but necessity is subjective," unquote. Well, Joe, necessity is subjective if you're not bleeding, and so maybe we should go and bleed all over you, and you would see from a subjective viewpoint how that felt. It might strike you as a bloody shame. The rules can get very complicated with sales tax. For example, the idea of exempting groceries from sales taxes sounded simple, but most states want to continue collecting taxes on takeout and prepared food on the grounds that you have someone else basically cooking for you and it's a luxury food. So in 2010, Wisconsin's Revenue Department released this 1,400-word memo titled Sales of Ice Cream Cakes and Similar Items, and described sometimes an ice cream cake in Wisconsin is a tax-free baked good, and in other cases it's a taxable prepared food, and the question hinges on several factors including the size of the cake, who decorated the cake, whether a majority of the cake's layers contain flour, and whether the seller provides utensils along with the cake. Now, what all this has to do with taxing tampons is a good question. In 1990, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that tampons met that state's definition of a medical appliance and thus deserved an exemption. But the state subsequently narrowed the exemption and tampons are taxed at the full rate yet again. The California bill proposed by Ms. Garcia, who is a Democrat, and Ling Chang, who is a Republican colleague, how about that for working across the aisle, avoids this ambiguity by simply creating an exemption for sanitary napkins and tampons, rather than a broad category of necessary medical or personal care products. Still, it would be added to a list of over 100 existing exemptions to the state's sales tax. It seems pretty necessary to me and for anybody who subjectively is a woman and who menstruates. But hey, that's just me, and this is the Surrealism Corner, and last 5 or 6, I've lost track, in the Surrealism Corner is, of course, Donald Trump. Time for another break. I'm Robin Morgan. This is Women's Media Center Live. And coming up, a discussion about, well, a kind of immortality, a way to give to the planet and do some good even after you've turned up your toes and croaked. So, coming right up. Don't go away.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
And we're back again. This time with a subject that some might consider a bit ghoulish or depressing, death, except that this approach to the subject I find really heartening and almost cheerful. You know, we once disposed of our dead in earth-friendly ways, no chemicals, biodegradable containers, that sort of thing. And we all know that now death and death care have become toxic, polluting industries in the United States. Well, my next guest, Dr. Suzanne Kelly, an independent scholar and writer, has written an extraordinary book called Greening Death. And it changed my thinking. And you see if it doesn't change yours. Dr. Suzanne Kelly. Suzanne, if I may, welcome to the program.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
You have written a really fantastic book in its writing, in its conceptual change that it, brings to pass with its readers, me included. It's quite special. It's called Greening Death, Reclaiming Burial Practices and Restoring Our Tie to the Earth. And it's available everywhere the books are sold now, and it's really special. I did not know until this book that we all heard about the American way of death, and we all are aware that it's a commercialized funeral industry that charges excessive prices for burying people in metal and mahogany as if, they weren't dead or could be preserved. I mean, we're aware of that, but I had thought up till this book that, well, cremation is, a more economical and more civilized way, except, of course, I'd never put 2 and 2 together and realized that the toxic chemicals released into the air are also not good for the planet. And I hadn't even thought that this had been an area of women's control,
Yes.
the dying and the death, until the Civil War, when there was a lot of death, and death became industrialized and professionalized and removed from women's control. So
Yes.
Tell our listeners who have not yet had a chance to read the book, but by God, I hope you will, tell them about this.
Well, let's see. So it's true, the history of our funerary practices, the way that we think about the funeral industry today, really began in the middle of the 1800s. It really started before the Civil War, when a sort of rise in urban population collided with new fears around sanitation. There were sort of 2 twin aims of the funeral industry, the development of the funeral industry. One was focused on sanitation, and one was focused on preservation. And so, that part of it is interesting because I think that there's this emphasis on the Civil War, and certainly the Civil War changed how we do death in the U.S. Because there were so many soldiers dying so far from home, from the North, and they needed to figure out a way to get these bodies back for burial for families who wanted it. And how else to do that if not to preserve them? But before this time, embalming was really seen as a fate worse than death. And so for those families who could afford it, there were these new anatomists on the scene who the Union Army hired to embalm these bodies and send them back home. But you would think that embalming would die out after that because it was sort of a temporary solution, right, to a terrible problem. But there were two things that actually allowed it to snowball. One was the death of Abraham Lincoln in 1865, and his body was embalmed and re-embalmed and embalmed and re-embalmed and sent across the country for Americans to gaze upon. And when they did, they were able to see this new embalming process. And some historians have pointed to that as a kind of symbolic overcoming, an overcoming of a war that had parted a nation. I also point out in the book that it also was representative of another overcoming that was really beginning to snowball at that time, an overcoming of nature.
Yep.
And then the other part of this is that the chemical companies who were creating these embalming fluids saw a business opportunity, and they started, creating workshops in schools, and these became our first mortuary schools. And so before that, it's true, women were the primary caretakers of the dead. It was done in an informal economy, in the home. It was seen as an extension of other kinds of care work, caring for children, caring for the sick, caring for the elderly, and it wasn't paid work. And sometimes these were women in the community who were birthing midwives or other kinds of healers who were specially trained in this and handed this information and knowledge down to other women. Sometimes they were just other members of the family. But as I point out in my book, it's not just, the green burial movement isn't just about a reclamation of practices. It's really a reclamation of lost knowledges that have seemingly disappeared, but that have just been sort of simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be tapped into.
Yeah, that's part of what I found so absolutely fascinating. I mean, that for example, the persistent myth that dead bodies are contaminated and a health hazard, when that's not actually true. But of course it serves the funeral industry, and it's become so deeply ingrained in our minds now. I mean, it's just fascinating. And of course, the minute labor is unpaid labor, where you can usually find women, the minute it becomes salaried, that's when the boys come in, or the minute the boys come in, it becomes salaried. I don't know which comes first.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting, and I talk about this in the book, in tandem with the green burial movement is this what's called the rising home funeral movement, which is really all about family-directed funerals. And there's an organization called the National Home Funerals Alliance that organized about 5 years ago. And if you look at this organization, it is primarily women. It is primarily women who are trying to connect families back to their funeral practices to help them direct their own funerals and take it out of the hands of the funeral industry. So it's sort of coming full circle in that way.
How can people, other than your book, find out more about this? I mean, one of the wonderful things about your book is you have a list of resources in the back. But is there a website that we can send them to?
Yeah, I mean, if people are looking for a green burial ground, and again, green burial is whole body earth burial without the use of chemical embalming fluid, without the use of hardwood and metal caskets, and without the use of a burial vault, and also depending upon the burial ground, with aims toward land preservation, conservation, and restoration. The Green Burial Council certifies green burial grounds, and so they're a great resource. They're a great place to go to if you're looking for a green burial ground. And also the National Home Funeral Alliance that I already mentioned, their website is also wonderful, a great resource. They also have a list of green burial sites.
I have to tell you that one of the things that appealed to me so much, one aspect of this was the conservation aspect, and we should talk more about that. But another was, I carry a universal donor card, so with blood, tissues, eye, corneas, whatever they can use. The aim being to be used and useful. But I had never thought beyond that point. And the idea of not just becoming, but realizing that one, in a just society, and the way the universe really wants to work, that humans are part of the food chain too, and the faster one can return to nature and be part of the food chain. That was so. Some of my listeners may find this macabre, but that was such a delightful moment for me.
Yeah, I think if you listen to the voices of green burial advocates, that this is really what you'll hear from them, that they want to give back after a lifetime of taking from the earth, that in the words of the environmental feminist philosopher Val Plumwood, that we are food too for other creatures, and that we are indeed part of nature. I mean, one of the things that environmental thinkers, like Aldo Leopold and Rachel Carson and even Vandana Shiva have been trying to get us to see is that, we're never going to heal this broken earth until we change the way that we think about nature, until we really shift our view of our place within the natural world. And green burial has so much promise toward that end because it really gives us practices that put us in relationship to the land. Of course, there are, Jews and Muslims have never really lost this sensibility. And around the world, I think it's important to point out that many places around the world still bury their dead in this way. We're
Right.
sort of unique in that way that our American death practices have been the polluting and unsustainable practices that they've been over the last century and a half.
Right, and that they have polluted the earth. I don't want to go on polluting the earth. After I've been, it would be nice to turn it around.
Well, it's interesting what a reversal it is because there is this, as you said, this prevailing social belief that somehow the dead body is a dangerous contaminant that can sort of pose a real threat to public health. And of course, the World Health Organization has been trying to get us to see for a long time that this couldn't be further from the truth, especially in times of natural disaster.
Right.
People rush to bury the dead, but really they should be rushing to help the living.
Yep.
But instead, what we've done is we've created, this serious reversal where we have created contaminants to contaminate not just the dead body through chemical embalming fluid and all these hardwoods and metal caskets and burial vaults, but we're also contaminating the earth. So, I always think about Mary Daly with respect to this. We really need to reverse the reversals of the narrative, right? We need to go back to the original narrative, is that the dead body is not a dangerous contaminant. These things are the actual things that are the contaminants.
That's right. And also what's lovely about this concept is that it resituates us as human beings as part of nature, not something separate from it, much less above it, God forbid, goddess forbid. But in fact, a part of it, and to dust you shall return. But that it can nurture life. I used to keep a small composting bin, even here in New York City, where I have a small garden, and I was not allowed to by my neighbors. They were afraid that rats would come.
Right.
But, and of course I can understand their concern, so I don't any longer. But there I was, and the process of composting itself, which I had learned, from visiting friends on farms, itself was sort of magical to me as an urban person. That garbage was turned back after a while into soil and rich soil that you could spread on the earth to make even better things and grow more healthily. I mean, nature is so wise in the cycle, and it's not surprising that when nature got screwed, women got screwed.
That's right. The composting matter, you hear this in the language of green burial advocates, just as you're describing it, right, thinking of themselves as compost. It's actually a woman, and I mentioned her in the book, Katrina Spade, who's trying to address green burial in urban areas because, when dust-to-dust practices existed 150 years ago in a prevailing way, 80% of the population lived in rural areas, and now 80% of the population lives in urban areas. She's been in the process of developing a prototype for what can only be described as a human composting center or a human composting machine that she imagines could be developed in different urban areas and where the composted bodies could actually be cycled and folded back in possibly to public parks in urban areas. So this is extending even above and beyond, the development of green burial grounds. Right,
because there are green burial grounds, listeners, but they're still few and far between. More all the time. But we need more of this and more of the consciousness. So thank you for doing this work, and Suzanne, and thank you for the book, which is called Greening Death, as in pea green and emerald green and wonderful greens, Greening Death, Reclaiming Burial Practices and Restoring Our Tie to the Earth. And it's just been released. Thank you, and thanks for being with us on Women's Media Center Live.
Thank you so much for having me.
One last quick break here at Women's Media Center Live, but I, Robin Morgan, will be back in just a few seconds with some fighting words.
You're listening to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan.
Welcome back again to some fighting words. I am almost inarticulate with rage about these crazy right-wing militia-oriented, paranoid ranchers who have seized federal lands in Oregon and are having a standoff while they sit there armed, saying that they will never be taken to prison and that they will shoot to, quote, defend themselves if anybody tries to arrest them for breaking the law. I'm outraged at them, and I'm also outraged that so far the federal government is not doing anything about it. Can you imagine what would happen if they were African American? Or, I don't know, the people who really originally owned that land, Native American? You think that they would just be waiting around the federal government to see, what should we do? I am particularly outraged because there's precedent for doing nothing. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm glad that this has not escalated into violence, and I respect the federal government trying to devise a strategy that doesn't repeat Waco, on the one hand. But on the other hand, how long can the Oregon standoff last? I mean, if the wooded, rural East Texas town of Trinidad is any example, the answer is it can last 15 years. You heard me right. In a wooded 47-acre compound on the Trinity River, about an hour southeast of Dallas, John Joe Gray, age 66, has quietly carried out what some call the longest standoff in America, a few days shy of 15 years. It officially ended in 2014 when a district attorney dropped charges. He just gave up. What do you know? He just like that, dropped charges. But the standoff continued because Gray and many law enforcement officials appeared to be unaware that the charges had been dropped. Gray, who was a carpenter linked to anti-government militia groups, he was charged with assaulting a state trooper after a December 1999 traffic stop, and he was jailed, but he was released on bond in January of the year 2000. He never showed up to court. He returned instead to his property, where he and his relatives armed themselves and patrolled barbed wire fences. And in a letter, he warned local officials that if they wanted to come get him, they needed to, quote, bring body bags, close quote. So they didn't come to get him. And they didn't come to get him. Again and again, they didn't come to get him for 15 years. Now, not that this is the only approach, the barricading yourself as a crazy approach, that white boys seem to be taking when they want to reseize federal lands from the government, lands that are wildlife preserves, like the one in Oregon, which is the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge near Burns, Oregon. It's not only those activists, but it's a state representative, a Republican from Utah, Ken Ivory, who is roaming the West with a pitch to cattle ranchers and conservative farmers who are upset with Washington controlling, unquote, the wide-open public spaces out here. He says, this land is your land, ranchers and farmers, not the federal government's. In other words, not yours and mine, the public's. Ivory is a business lawyer, not a farmer. He's from Salt Lake City, and he's part of a growing Republican-led movement pushing the federal government to hand over to the states millions of acres of Western public lands. Take that, Teddy Roosevelt. And mostly what they're interested in is not preservation of the land. Oh, no. Rich stores, they say, of coal, timber, and grazing grass. It's like having your hands on the lever of a modern-day Louisiana Purchase, says Ivory. He founded the American Lands Council, which is a Utah-based group that receives support from Americans for Prosperity, which is the group backed by the Koch brothers, our favorite people. My outrage is with the federal government, which seems to be doing not much, and the inability to come up with a strategy that is peaceable, but if they want to live by the sword, then they should, you know what, by the sword. These ranchers, these protesters, these treasonous people who claim they're acting in the name of the government. That land belongs to our land. And if it belongs to any one group, try for the Native Americans. But as I said earlier, if they or black folks were to take it over, watch the bullets fly. And that's it for today. This program is syndicated, but if you can't find the broadcast on a radio station in your area, you can always visit us at WMClive.com. There you can find the show, plus the archive of all our previous episodes. And we're at iTunes worldwide. There you can stream, download, and subscribe to the show's podcast. Also, be sure to find WMC Live on Facebook and Twitter. Portions of this program were taped earlier. Opinions expressed here do not necessarily represent the WMC. Here's the family for Women's Media Center Live. Regina K. Scully is our founding sponsor. Julie Burton, Women's Media Center President, is executive producer. And I'm Robin Morgan, your producer and host. Thank you for being with us. Don't forget to join us next week right here on Women's Media Center Live.
For the smartest talk about news, politics, sex, books, religion, race, and more, tune your radio to Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan. Audacious, witty, provocative, informative, and fun. It's Women's Media Center Live with Robin Morgan on WMCLive.com. Talk radio with a brain.